Before I tell you how an entitled HOA Kerren tried to hijack my cabin for 100 uninvited guests, I need you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this chaos turns into the most satisfying downfall you've ever heard. The shouting was the first thing I heard before I even opened the cabin door. Dozens of voices overlapping one another, the thrum of car engines idling in my driveway, the scrape of coolers dragged across gravel. My chest tightened as I stepped outside. The late afternoon air smelled of gasoline and charcoal lighter fluid, and for a dizzy second, I thought I had stumbled into the wrong life. A man in sunglasses was unloading folding chairs. A woman carried trays of food toward the front porch. Children darted between cars laughing, as though this place already belonged to them. I raised my voice and demanded to know what they were doing on my property. A few faces turned toward me with blank confusion. One man answered without hesitation. He said Kerren told them the cabin was reserved for the evening. My jaw clenched. My cabin, the one I had saved for years to purchase, the one I had envisioned as my quiet escape from the grind of long hours and constant pressure. Now 100 strangers were setting up camp, as though I were some hotel clerk late with their keys. The crowd murmured and shifted, and then I heard her voice. It carried with practiced sharpness like the crack of glass breaking. Kerren. She stood near the gate, arms crossed, smug smile painted on her face. She wore that pastel cardigan she always wore at community meetings, the one that made her look like she belonged at the head of a table giving orders. Her eyes glimmered with superiority, as if the chaos unfolding was nothing more than proof of her influence. I knew Kerren long before this moment. She was the self-appointed guardian of our neighborhood, the one who policed trash bins and lawn heights, as though a crooked mailbox were a crime against humanity. Her favorite weapon was the phrase HOA regulations. She used it to intimidate newcomers, to silence dissent, and to crown herself queen of a kingdom no one had asked for. I had watched her humiliate neighbors in front of others, all under the guise of keeping standards. I had never liked her, but I had also never expected her to step this far over the line. She looked at me with a sly tilt of her chin. She said I should not make a scene. The cabin, she declared, had been generously offered for the community gathering. She spoke as if her word carried legal weight. My fists clenched at my sides. I told her the cabin was mine, private, and untouchable by any rules she invented. She dismissed my protest with a flick of her hand, and laughter that made the crowd turn against me. For a moment I tried reason. I explained that I owned this place outright, that no agreement, no policy, and certainly no neighbor gave her the right to claim it. She raised her voice louder than mine, painting me as selfish, greedy, unwilling to share. The crowd shifted again, leaning into her narrative. I saw doubt in their faces. Some nodded with sympathy for her. Others glared at me as if I betrayed some unspoken community pact. The humiliation burned hot against my skin. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs as Kerren stepped closer. She whispered so only I could hear. She said if I resisted, she would make sure every neighbor knew me as the man who ruined the community event. She smiled like a predator testing the softness of its prey. Then she turned back to the people and announced that everything was under control, that the party would proceed as planned. The cheer that followed rang in my ears like mockery. I stood rooted to the ground, breathing, in the acrid mix of exhaust fumes and arrogance. Rage tangled with disbelief. How dare she? This was not a community park. It was not an empty hall waiting for reservation. It was my sanctuary, my blood, my sweat, my savings. And yet she had twisted the truth so effortlessly that 100 people believed her. But beneath the anger, a sharper thought formed. I realized she had overplayed her hand. She believed her own performance so completely that she could not imagine it failing. That arrogance was her weakness. And if I stayed calm, if I refused to bow to her showmanship, I could find a crack in her armor. I looked her in the eye. Her smirk widened as though she had already won. But I did not argue further. I let silence stretch between us until even she seemed unsettled. Finally, I said in a low, steady voice, "Fine. You want a gathering. Let's see how it plays out." The words tasted bitter, but they were not surrender. They were promise. I turned and walked back toward the cabin door, leaving Kerren to bask in the illusion of triumph. Behind me, the crowd erupted into chatter, unloading more supplies convinced of her authority. She laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear, declaring that she had taken care of everything. She thought she had cornered me. She thought she had claimed my home as her stage. What she did not realize was that by stepping onto this ground, by bringing 100 witnesses into this lie, she had given me everything I needed. The sun dipped lower bleeding orange light across the cabin walls. My hand tightened on the door handle. I inhaled slow, steady, and silent. The battle had only just begun. The morning of the supposed reservation arrived heavy with an uneasy silence. I brewed coffee in the cabin kitchen, trying to convince myself that Kerren's arrogance had reached its limit, that she had spun her lie for attention and would let it fizzle out. I stepped onto the porch and listened to the stillness of the woods. For a fleeting moment, I believed peace might win. Then I heard the grind of engines approaching in waves. One car after another rolled up the gravel drive until my once secluded escape looked like the parking lot of a stadium. Doors slammed and voices multiplied. Laughter rang out as coolers thudded against the ground. The sharp scent of grilled meat already drifted from portable smokers. 100 strangers bustled across my property, as if the cabin had been theirs for years. I stood at the top of the porch steps, gripping the railing, my chest burning with disbelief. A man waved at me cheerfully, calling me the host. Before I could answer, Kerren emerged from the crowd like a queen surveying her kingdom. She wore her victory like a cloak's shoulders, square chin lifted, a wide smile plastered on her face. She raised a stack of papers and shook them in the air, shouting that she had the official permit from the HOA. People clapped and cheered. Some glanced up at me with expectant smiles, waiting for me to throw open the doors and welcome them inside. My voice broke through the noise as I told them this was private property. The cheers faltered, but Kerren's voice rose stronger. She announced that I had generously agreed to provide my cabin for the community celebration. She called me a good neighbor. The way she twisted the lie in front of them made bile rise in my throat. I shouted that she was lying. She laughed in reply and told them not to worry, that I was simply nervous about such a large crowd. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. The weight of 100 doubtful eyes pressed against me. I marched down the steps and demanded that they all leave. The sun beat hot against my back as I stood before them. Kerren stepped closer and waved her papers under my nose. I snatched them from her hands and flipped through the pages. They were nothing more than old HOA newsletters stapled together. My jaw tightened. I held them up for everyone to see and said these were not permits. Kerren shrugged and smirked, claiming the real documents were the board and that I should stop embarrassing myself. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd, yet many still sided with her. She placed a hand dramatically over her heart and said I was trying to ruin the community spirit. She asked how a single evening of sharing space could possibly hurt me. The people cheered again, swept into her performance. Their support bruised deeper than I expected. My words bounced off their blind faith like stones against steel. I tried again to explain. I pulled out my deed and showed them the property boundaries. I told them that this cabin was bought with my savings, that no clause, no bylaw, no neighbor could take that away. Some leaned closer to look at the document, but Kerren's voice slashed across my explanation. She shouted that I was hiding behind paperwork to keep joy from others. She called me selfish, greedy, and antisocial. The crowd booed. I felt heat rising in my face. It was in that moment I saw her strategy. She did not care about rules or truth. She thrived on spectacle. She knew that if she made enough noise, as she painted herself as the benevolent neighbor and me as the miser, she could twist perception until reality bent her way. My logical explanations would never pierce the wall she built with her volume and arrogance. I clenched the deed in my hand. The temptation to scream at them, to force them off my land, burned hot in my throat. But I swallowed the fire. Anger would only feed her game. I needed something sharper than rage. I needed patience. I looked at her and saw her smile stretch wider, believing she had won. She believed that because the crowd clapped and jeered at her command, she had complete control. I gave her nothing in return. My silence unsettled her for a fraction of a second, though. She covered it with another laugh. She leaned toward me and whispered that I should stop fighting because she always got what she wanted. Her breath smelled of sweet wine, though it was still early afternoon. Her eyes gleamed with the certainty of victory. I stepped back and let the crowd engulf her again. She raised her arms like a conductor directing an orchestra. The music of laughter and clinking bottles swelled around her. Yet as I turned and walked toward the lock gate at the edge of the drive, I felt a steadier rhythm begin inside me. Each step carried the weight of realization. Confrontation would not beat her. Strategy would. I glanced once over my shoulder. Kerren stood with her followers basking in borrowed power. She thought she had humiliated me, silenced me, crushed me under the weight of numbers. What she did not know was that she had revealed her greatest weakness. Her need for attention had brought every witness I could ever want. Her arrogance had set the stage for her own collapse. The roar of the crowd faded behind me as I rested my hand on the metal gate. The lock glinted in the fading light. I whispered under my breath, not for them, but for myself. I said she wanted a spectacle. She would have one. And when the curtain fell, the only person left exposed would be her. The crowd swelled louder as the evening shadows stretched across the clearing. Music thumped from a speaker someone had dragged out of a trunk. Laughter rolled across the lawn, mixing with the sizzle of food on portable grills. My cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage. And Kerren stood at the center, performing like the star she believed herself to be. She waved her hands and directed people where to set tables and where to line up coolers. Every command fed her ego. She thrived on the spectacle, certain that she had broken me. But I had not broken. I had shifted. The anger that had threatened to spill over earlier hardened into focus. I retreated quietly to the cabin porch and slipped inside unnoticed. My phone was already buzzing in my pocket. I raised it and began recording through the window. Kerren's shrill laughter, the crowd chanting her name, her voice declaring that the cabin belonged to the community. Every second captured became proof. Every arrogant word she spoke added weight to the rope she was tying around her own neck. I walked to the desk in the corner where I kept documents. The deed, HOA bylaws, the very pages she had mocked earlier. I laid them neatly on the table, evidence stacked against her. I imagined the expression on her face when these same papers silenced her performance. For now I let her dig deeper. Outside, the voices grew louder. I stepped back onto the porch and watched Kerren raise a wine glass and a toast. She shouted that the neighborhood owed her gratitude for arranging such a perfect gathering. They cheered and clapped. 100 witnesses now bound to her lie. I leaned against the railing and let the moment etch itself into memory. Her arrogance was no longer merely irritating. It was a perfect trap. I unlocked my truck from the driveway and pulled out a portable camera mounted near the gate. With calm precision, I adjusted its angle so it captured every car, every cooler, every stranger trespassing. Evidence layered on evidence. Kerren believed she had won because she shouted louder. She had no idea that silence could be sharper than sound. She caught sight of me then and strutted forward. She asked loudly if I was ready to admit defeat. Her smirk glowed under the last light of the day. I gave her nothing more than a measured smile. I said only, "Enjoy your evening," and turned my back on her. My tone made her falter, though she quickly covered it with laughter. The crowd roared with her again, but I had seen the flicker of unease in her eyes. Hours passed. The party grew wilder. Trash scattered across the grass. Empty bottles clinked on the porch rail. The smell of smoke from an open fire pit stung the air. My jaw tightened at every careless act, but I held my ground. Each piece of recklessness only strengthened my case. Kerren strutted between groups, accepting praise, as though she were the hostess of a grand estate. She posed for photos and promised future gatherings. Her vanity swelled to blinding heights. When the time felt right, I made my move. I slipped into the cabin and dialed the sheriff's office. Calm, steady words carried through the line. Trespassing. False claims of authority. A crowd of 100. Evidence recorded. The dispatcher assured me a unit was on the way. I ended the call and felt my heartbeat steady like the beat of a drum before battle. Next, I reached out to the HOA president. His voice cracked with disbelief as I described Kerren's actions. He asked for proof. I promised he would have more proof than he could ever imagine. He muttered curses under his breath about her history of arrogance and assured me he would arrive in person. The stage was set. Now all I needed was patience. I locked the cabin door from inside and walked to the gate at the edge of the property. With a deliberate motion, I slid the heavy padlock into place and snapped it shut. The clang rang out like the first note of a symphony. The road beyond was closed. No one was leaving until the truth arrived. When I returned to the yard, Kerren confronted me again. She demanded to know why I was skulking around. Her cheeks were flushed, her words slurred by wine, but her arrogance burned undimmed. She declared that I should unlock the gate, because guests deserve freedom. I smiled thinly and said the gate was for their safety. She narrowed her eyes, suspicion flickering across her face. The crowd still cheered for her. She clung to their noise like armor. I leaned close and spoke, just for her ears. I told her she wanted a spectacle. She was about to have one. She blinked in confusion, then laughed and called me dramatic. She turned back to the people, raising her arms for another toast. The crowd cheered again, but their voices were framed with fatigue. Some guests glanced uneasily toward the lock gate. The first wail of sirens echoed faintly through the trees. Heads turned. Conversations stuttered. Kerren froze for a heartbeat, then plastered on her smile. She shouted that everything was fine, that she had arranged security for their comfort. Her words rang hollow even as she delivered them. I watched her confidence crack, like thin ice beneath heavy steps. The night air cooled and carried the distant red and blue glow closer. I stood silently on the porch, arms folded as the crowd shifted nervously. Kerren raised her voice again, insisting that nothing was wrong. Yet doubt spread among the people. Whispers stirred. Some pulled out phones, filming the scene. The energy that once belonged to her began to unravel thread by thread. The sirens grew louder, filling the clearing with dread and anticipation. Kerren's voice wavered as she tried to command attention, but the crowd no longer listened. All eyes turned to the road where flashing lights broke through the trees. She looked at me, then eyes wide with something she had never shown before. Fear. I met her gaze and offered the faintest smile. The curtain was about to fall. The flashing lights cut through the trees, bathing the driveway in red and blue. Engines idled as two patrol cars pulled to a stop. The crowd shifted, uncertain and restless. Kerren raised her voice, shrill and trembling, as she announced that everything was under control. Her words scraped the night air, desperate but hollow. She held her chin high, though her hands trembled around the stem of her glass. The sheriff stepped out, calm, deliberate, each footstep crunching on gravel. He scanned the yard, his expression unreadable, before resting his gaze on me. I stepped forward from the porch, documents in one hand, phone in the other. I said clearly that this was my property, that none of these people had been invited, that I had evidence of the trespass and the deception that brought them here. I handed him the deed. Then I showed him the recordings. Kerren's voice echoing through the speaker, boasting that she had reserved my cabin, waving false permits, claiming authority she did not possess. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as the recording played. He turned to Kerren. She opened her mouth to protest, but only a stutter emerged. She lifted her hands, waving toward the crowd. She claimed it was a misunderstanding, that I had agreed, and then changed my mind. But the murmurs spreading through the crowd betrayed her. They had heard her voice on my recording. They had seen her arrogance displayed, without disguise. The HOA president arrived moments later, stepping from his car with a thunderous expression. His voice boomed across the yard as he demanded to know what Kerren thought she was doing. She tried to interrupt, tried to spin another story, but he silenced her with a raised hand. He declared that the HOA had no authority over private property, that her claims were fabricated and disgraceful. He told the sheriff she had acted entirely on her own and that she would face consequences for abusing her position. The crowd turned then. Whispers became laughter. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others pulled out phones to capture the scene. Kerren's face flushed deep crimson as she shouted that they should stop filming, that this was all a mistake. But the more she begged, the more amused they became. The image of the queen of the neighborhood unraveling before her subjects was too rich to ignore. The sheriff stepped closer and told her to calm herself. He explained in steady tones that she had orchestrated an unauthorized gathering on private property, misled dozens of residents, and attempted to bully the rightful owner. Her lips trembled as she tried one last offense. She claimed she only wanted to bring the community together. The president cut her short, telling her she had brought shame instead. His words struck like a gavel closing a case. I stood silently watching the transformation. The woman who had strutted across my yard hours earlier had shrunk into something pitiful. Her voice cracked as she pleaded with the sheriff not to file charges. She begged the president not to remove her from the board. She even turned to me, eyes wide with desperation, asking me to forgive her. Her arrogance had dissolved into fear, but it was too late. The sheriff ordered the party to disperse. Guests gathered their things, quickly embarrassed by their complicity. Cars began to roll down the drive, one after another, headlights cutting through the darkness. A few guests muttered apologies to me as they passed. Others laughed quietly at Kerren, who stood frozen as her audience abandoned her. The sound of engines faded until only silence and humiliation remained. The president stepped close and told Kerren she was suspended effective immediately. Formal proceedings would strip her of all authority. She gasped as though the words had struck her lungs. She tried to protest again, but her voice faltered under his glare. For the first time I saw her without the armor control. She looked small, fragile, exposed. The sheriff told her she would be fined for trespassing and unlawful assembly. He warned her that further action could be taken if I pressed charges. She turned to me again, desperate. She whispered that I did not need to ruin her life. I met her gaze, steady and unyielding. I told her she had ruined her own. Her shoulders sagged. The glass slipped from her hand and shattered at her feet. The sound echoed sharp against the quiet night. She covered her face with her hands, but the cameras still caught every detail. Within hours, the clips would spread through social media. Within days, she would be remembered not as the self-styled guardian of order, but as the woman who tried to steal a cabin and lost everything. When the sheriff finally escorted her away, the night felt different. The air was lighter, the silence cleaner. The porch light glowed warmly against the dark trees. I stepped back inside the cabin and closed the door behind me. The lock clicked solid and final. I exhaled a breath I had been holding for hours. Later, I sat with a mug of coffee, watching the first traces of dawn brush the horizon. My phone buzzed with notifications. Videos of Kerren's meltdown had already gone viral. One clip showed her screaming about permits that did not exist. Another showed her begging as the sheriff read her rights. Someone had added captions calling her reservation queen. The internet had done what justice alone could not. It had immortalized her humiliation. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself a thin smile. The cabin was quiet again, the way it was meant to be. The battle had ended not with fists or fury, but with patience and truth. Kerren had wanted a stage, and she had received one. But the show had ended with her downfall. I whispered into the silence that peace had returned. And for the first time since she arrived, I believed it.